This computer. Hi, Rick. It's lovely to have you here to chat with us and to put this interview on the VR School website. I'd like to introduce Dr. Rick Skarbez, who's a lecturer in computer science at La Trobe. I think I've got that right.
That is
And the
correct.
author of many very interesting papers, and someone I connected with a few years ago, I have to say, in a virtual room somewhere at a IEEE VR conference where Rick organised just a gathering of the Aussies and New Zealanders, I think. It was the Aussies and the Kiwis.
That is correct. I have fond memories of that conference, even though it didn't really happen.
Yes, correct, correct. But anyway, Rick, thank you so much for agreeing to have a chat today. I mean, I picked up a paper that you had published last year, an opinion piece called It's Time to Let Go of Virtual Reality. And I'd like to talk about that. But before I do, could you just tell us a bit about yourself, your professional background, and, you know, what you're interested in terms of mixed reality?
Absolutely. So yeah, as you said, I'm Rick Skarbez. I'm at La Trobe University now in the computer science department. I'm originally from America, as you may now be able to tell that I'm talking. I did my PhD research at the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill, where a lot of really great virtual reality research was done with professors Fred Brooks, who sadly passed away last year, and Mary Whitten. And then I spent a year working at Virginia Tech in Virginia in the United States with some other eminent mixed reality researchers. And then I came here. So I've been in Australia and at La Trobe since 2018. So it's going to be 6 years in June. And as much as those years were significantly disrupted by COVID, I think, as they were for all of us, but I'm starting to get my feet under myself in Australia. And what I'm interested in about mixed reality is uh I mean, gosh, I've got my fingers in a lot of pies when it comes to mixed reality, but my main interest is in virtual reality and specifically looking at what aspects of virtual experience translate to the real world. And in what ways are virtual or simulated experiences like the equivalent experience that you might have in the real world, and in what ways are they not like the equivalent experience that you might have in the real world? And that, I think, has real practical ramifications when it comes especially to teaching and learning. So if we're trying to do any kind of knowledge transfer or skills transfer with these mixed reality technologies, it's really important to know what skills can we transfer and what knowledge can we transfer and what can't we do effectively. So I don't consider myself necessarily a VR evangelist in the sense that I don't think it's the right solution for every problem. And if you can do the job just as well with a textbook or a TV or, some paper models, then by all means, we should do that because it's going to be accessible to more people. But I do believe that there are some things that VR may be better at than anything we've had before. And I guess I'm trying to find out what those things are.
Fantastic. Now we're using the term mixed reality here, and I suppose that leads us into the paper that you wrote and published with your colleagues, Mrs. Smith and Mary Whitten last year. But I mean, it is an alphabet soup, isn't it? So we talk about, VR, AR, augmented reality, mixed reality. We talk about, in my field, immersive learning, for instance, or immersive technologies. And so people are quite use different terminology, sometimes are quite confused about what those mean. And of course, some of those terms have changed over time in terms of what they mean as well. So I mean, you've written a very interesting paper, which really looks at revising, I suppose, quite a famous continuum that was produced, but also brings us to the present, I suppose, where we have a kind of new types of technological breakthroughs with headsets in particular, and those coming out at the moment, where you're arguing that there should be perhaps a shift in terminology. So could you talk a little bit about It's Time to Let Go of Virtual Reality? I mean, here's the paper here. I'll put a little link up onto the posts on the VR School website. But yeah, I'd love to hear your perspective on your thoughts in terms of the paper.
Yeah, so thank you very much for the kind words in the introduction to the paper. I think you've really accurately summed up the problem that we were trying to address in that paper, which is that there is an alphabet soup. There's VR, AR, mixed reality MR, there's XR, which was originally just a variable, but then people started coming up with a word that the X would stand for. So we have extended reality, we have the metaverse, now we have Apple with spatial computing. And I think it's confusing enough for me, and this is, how I've chosen to make my living. So I can't imagine what it would be like for someone just trying to dip their toes into this field and understand what all of this means. Why are all these different terms? And I think, frankly, a big part of it is branding, right? People want to differentiate themselves. So mixed reality as a term existed going back to that other continuum that you spoke of. The Stanley Milgram and Fumio Kishino in the 90s wrote about the reality virtuality continuum. And mixed reality dates back at least that far. And originally it just meant literally a mixture of realities. It's not virtual reality. And it's not real reality. It's somewhere in between. And then I think specifically on this one, I'm going to point the finger at Microsoft because they wanted to say that the HoloLens was not augmented reality. It was something else. So they co-opted the term mixed reality as sort of in my opinion, a branding exercise. So there, and the same thing happens with everybody. I can't necessarily blame them even, but lots of people have vested interests in various terms sort of becoming the term of art. And what I argued for in that paper, along with Missy and Mary, is not so much that mixed reality, even though that's the term that we specifically argued for, not so much that that be the term, as let's pick a winner. The longer we spend in this state of not knowing what to call what we're doing, the more it hurts the field. I think it has legitimate negative impacts on the work we do and the people doing it. So we argued as a placeholder, just let's call it all mixed reality, because I think it is, right? I think it has the benefit of being true in that all of these technologies are giving us a way to mix computer generated content into our real world experiences. It may be more virtual, as in what we would usually call virtual reality, or more real in what we would usually call augmented reality. But there's always a mixture of these two in really any technology mediated environment. So we argued, let's pick a winner. And maybe Apple is doing that for us with spatial computing. We might talk about that more in a minute. But also that we need to report better in our research. So I think that was our main takeaway in that paper, was that these technologies, from a technology perspective, they're more similar than different, right? Whether it's VR, AR, MR, XR, whatever you want to call it. But in terms of how they're used, they may be used to very different ends. So I think it's really important for the academic researchers out there, whether that's learning researchers or more traditional virtual reality researchers or computer human interaction researchers, to say the tools that you're using and the relevant characteristics of those tools, report that. Don't just assume that everybody knows what you're talking about because you're using an off-the-shelf headset. Right? What if we have that information in the paper, it can then be used for further analysis, like in a meta-analysis, to try to figure out what characteristics of these headsets matter. So that's sort of our takeaway for researchers. Our takeaway for practitioners is, gosh, we should be able to make this easier for people, right? Especially people who just want to use the stuff, that are in the trenches, in a classroom, in an operating room, on a battlefield, wherever you might be trying to make use of these technologies, you shouldn't have to care whether it's augmented reality or virtual reality or what have you. You should just be able to say, I need a headset with an application that does this. And hopefully we're taking some steps in that direction, at least technologically.
Well, it's interesting that you mentioned the term spatial computing, because I found myself saying it more, Rick. I don't know if it's because of all the PR from Apple, but you know, trying to kind of, I talked about XR and I want to talk about a broad umbrella, I suppose, to practitioners. But I found myself more recently talking about spatial computing, which is, of course, introducing another word into the lexicon. But perhaps it's a better word. I don't know. What do you think about that?
I am actually in agreement with that. It is yet another word which in the short term is going to introduce more confusion. But I think, with the possible exception of the mixed reality term, that it more accurately describes what is happening. The commonality of virtual reality, mixed reality, augmented reality, extended reality, immersive learning, they all mix digital content with the real world in some way, and B, they all take advantage of the spatial location of the user and their body. So I think that mixed reality and spatial computing are very compatible. I think spatial computing has a very powerful marketing wing behind it, which may enable it to gain more traction than some of these other terms. And I really do think that it contains more than a grain of truth, right? In all of these applications, what makes VR different from looking at a screen, even a really big screen, right? Like, what makes VR different from like an IMAX movie is that space matters. You can move around, you can look around, you can wave your hands around, and these are acceptable ways of interacting with the system. So really the spatial aspect is core to what I would consider a mixed reality experience. And I endorse the spatial computing term, right? I think it's one that I would be happy with if that ends up winning out. I'll put it that way.
Yeah. I mean, interestingly, I've been thinking about, I go and talk to teachers, we do projects in schools, particularly using VR, but really when we begin those projects, we talk about spatialising the curriculum. Fundamentally, what curriculum is best suited to spatialisation? And not only spatialisation, but the temporal as well with VR. So time and space combined, because of course they can be manipulated in virtual worlds to different extents. But I mean, I think, maybe it's a winner, but I'm not sure. Yeah.
Yeah, I don't know if I can pick a winner. I don't know if that's my job or if I'm very good at it. But like I said, if I'd be happier with that one than some of the alternatives. I'll go that far.
So as an educator, what do you think we have to look forward to in this field of spatial computing or mixed reality or whatever we want to call it?
I think that, and I don't think I've come up with this idea, but I'm not sure I've seen it expressed in this way elsewhere. I may be borrowing it from someone and I'm missing my reference, in which case I do apologize. But I have an acronym called RIDES, RIDES, like at a theme park, that I think of when I'm trying to evaluate whether it's a good opportunity for spatialization, for converting into mixed or virtual reality. And that's referring to qualities of the target experience. So if it is rare, impossible, dangerous, expensive, those are all things that make it possibly a good fit for VR or simulation in general, right? So it may be more than one of those, right? If you want to go to an archaeological excavation, for example, it may be all of the above. I like to add one or more S's at the end, because that that captures where this might go in the future. So by S, I usually mean standardizable and or scalable, right? So some of these experiences and some of the productive uses of VR in learning and training rely on the fact that it can provide a standardized experience to multiple users, right? So the idea of a simulated patient, some of your viewers and or listeners may be familiar with this idea in medicine, where you have somebody, essentially you hire actors to pretend to have a particular disorder, right? And that is part of the, not just the training, but the evaluation process for these young medical trainees, right? They need to be able to get the right information out of this actor, this simulated patient. Doing that in VR or in mixed reality or in spatial computing may enable not just that it's possible, right? The idea that it's possible is good, but not that interesting. If it's already possible, you can pay money and get an actor to come do that. The benefit is that it is standardizable. Everybody is going to get the same experience. If your guy is grumpy or has a bad day or is late for lunch, you might not have the same experience as one of your colleagues. In VR, or I'll stick with VR for now because I'm specifically talking about virtual type reality. But it's a standardizable experience. Everybody's going to get the same, good, bad, or indifferent. It's going to be the same for everybody, and it's scalable, right? One of the problems with simulated patients is that they are expensive and difficult to access. Usually, you only get to have them during your evaluation. But if you have a virtual standardized patient, you can do as many patient interviews as you have the patients for, right? So that's really a strong benefit of virtual reality. And it also scales in the sense that it might, in the long run, be cheaper and more widely accessible than other ways of conveying this information, right? It seems a little bit of a pipe dream right now, even with virtual reality technology being cheaper and better than it's ever been. It's still beyond the budget or access for a lot of educators, right? Or there might be one in a classroom, not one for every student, that sort of thing. But if we look into the future, it's possible that you can design an experience once and then have it administered to tens or hundreds or thousands of students, right? If you want somebody to feel like what it is to go to the top of Mount Everest, there are only a few dozen people that get that experience in a year, and it's dangerous and it's expensive and all these things. But if you can get 80% of what it's like through virtual reality, you can give that experience to tens of thousands of people, right? So its ride is sort of the characteristics of the experience, but then you want it to be standardizable, you want it to be scalable, you want it to be supported. So you can tack these S's onto the end to make a longer acronym that I think conveys some of why we think VR is a good idea for education.
As a computer scientist, I mean, you're talking a bit about virtual agents there. With the medical scenario. I mean, I suppose, the integration of artificial intelligence into mixed reality or, spatial computing really will have profound effects. I might be wrong, but you'll have much more naturalistic interactions. You'll have real-time learning, machine learning as it goes. And of course, you could actually have quite adaptive virtual agents, couldn't you, depending on the interaction or the scenario. Could you talk a little bit about, that kind of intersection between AI and MR?
I certainly can. I will only talk a little bit because the AI side is not my research area, and I don't want to say things that turn out to be lies. But certainly one can expect more conversational type user interfaces to come into existence. And that is an area that has been its own field of study in the human computer interaction community for a number of years, right? So I don't think I'm speaking out of turn when I say that we're reinventing the wheel a little bit with artificial intelligence, in that we're not going back and learning the lessons that previous generations of human computer interaction researchers have tried to teach us. So I think there is a lot to be gained from going back and looking at sort of conversational user interfaces, even in the 90s and early 2000s, even though we didn't have the artificial intelligence technology that we have today. There are a lot of lessons that can be learned from that research. In general, though, I think there is the potential for a lot of benefit for mixed reality applications, certainly in the form of not just virtual agents, virtual humans, but also more amenable user interfaces in general, right? So one of the problems with spatial computing is that you don't have a keyboard generally. So keyboard and mouse is maybe not the only way to interact with the computer, but it's a very high bandwidth channel if you're a touch typist, right? You can get a lot of information into your computer pretty quickly. Virtual keyboards are slow and bad, right? So like you don't really want to be using virtual reality even to enter a password or an email address, right? It's a very frustrating experience if you've ever had to do that before. Making conversational user interfaces more practical, more plausible is, I think, an underrated benefit of sort of ChatGPT-like technologies. So in future generations of spatial computing technology, you may be able to point at an icon and say select, right? Or you may be able to highlight some text and say make this bold, right? Even simple commands like that would really increase the productivity of VR applications, spatial computing applications. So I think that is maybe the more powerful application of AI to spatial computing.
Plus, we often forget how, how rich and long the field of virtual reality in particular, but other types of MR is. I mean, it's, we're talking decades and decades and decades of research into the field. Yeah. Even though the commercial availability of the hardware is it's only what, 9 years old, really, for the average person.
Yes, exactly right.
So there's decades of research behind this, and particular subfields which are really rich in terms of the lessons that they've given.
Absolutely right. Yeah. So that would be my second takeaway, I guess, or third take, however many takeaways for any researchers who might be listening or watching or reading. These fields didn't come into existence overnight, right? Virtual reality and augmented reality have been studied since Ivan Sutherland in the late 1960s. There's more than 50 years of history in virtual and augmented reality. Human-computer interaction and conversational user interfaces and artificial intelligence have been studied in a meaningful way, in a way that we would recognize today since the 1980s, right, at least. So just because, the Oculus Rift made VR commercially viable, or ChatGPT brought AI to the common knowledge, doesn't mean that these technologies are only 5 and 10 years old. That's the point of doing research, is to predict what's going to happen in the future, and we don't always know what's going to be useful. So, I will speak from personal experience and advice to anyone watching is do the reading. Like, it seems boring. We like to build stuff, like, especially I'm speaking to my fellow engineers out there. It's fun to build things. It's fun to write programs. But we don't have to be reinventing the wheel every time we build something. Like, a lot of smart people have spent a lot of years making these technologies viable. let's stand on their shoulders instead of just trying to reinvent everything.
And of course, one of the things is too the increase in interdisciplinarity in the field, which I've noticed by going to the technical VR conferences, where there was, you know, when I first started going, that would have been 2016. I didn't see a lot of interdisciplinarity, but I do now. It's actually incredible. It's just blossomed. There's always been interdisciplinary research, but you can really see it at the forefront now. I think that's exciting because it also works to translate what the technical means into practice.
Absolutely right. So I think that that is the biggest benefit associated with Oculus and Meta coming into and now Apple coming into the field. It used to be if you wanted to do VR research, you had to be an engineer because you had to build the equipment and maintain the equipment yourself. So that is the difference in the last 10 years, that you don't have to be a computer engineer, an electrical engineer, a computer scientist to do meaningful work in virtual reality.
So, I mean, it's very exciting, I suppose, that I can have conversations with people like you, Rick, that we can go to the same conferences and we can have, you know, incredibly meaningful kind of, you know, interactions, I suppose. Have you got any last words of wisdom?
No, I think I've already been using this as my soapbox, but you know, you can talk about it all as mixed reality or spatial computing. I'm fine with either one. AI is potentially going to revolutionize user interfaces, not necessarily revolutionize because a lot of the ideas date back 10, 20, 30 years, but make it more viable, just like VR, Oculus and Meta did for VR. And if you're out there as a researcher, read the old papers. Like, they're not irrelevant just because they're old. The technology was different, but the ideas largely still hold up. So please don't be afraid of your local library.
Thank you, Dr. Rick Skarbez, La Trobe University. Oh, my lights come back on. Fantastic. It's been great catching up, and I'll put a link to Rick's paper in the VR School website post, and yeah, and a link to Rick's profile at La Trobe University. But thanks again, Rick.
You're very welcome. Thanks for having me on. I've really enjoyed it.
Thank you.